Hello everybody, it's True Detective here. Let's make a little Linux video for you guys over there because Linux and learning it is important for some of you. It's not important for everybody, but there are those who are interested in that. Figure out if you are going to benefit from this knowledge, this understanding and this skill with the open source operating system. Little bit about the history of Linux. It came about from Finland. Linux is nowadays used in a lot of servers. It's also used in a lot of smartphones. The Linux kernel in Android. The user space in Android compared to Linux operating system on the desktop, on the other hand, it's a completely different ball game. So Linux kernel is very versatile. It can be even applied in some embedded devices. Linux is probably also used in war zones. So learning this stuff, that's great. What about Linux distros then? That's where you're going to be acquainted with this whole notion of Linux. Well, you're going to learn about distros like Ubuntu. You're going to learn about distros like Arch, Debian, Red Hat, Fedora. Some distros, they are community projects, and some distros, they are owned by a corporation, and they are developed and maintained by a corporation like Red Hat. Ubuntu comes from a private held company called Canonical. It's based in Great Britain. Normal home use of Linux, what do you need to know? Hardware compatibility. You have to understand some things about hardware compatibility. How do you figure out this? Well, you test it. How do you test Linux? Well, you boot it. How you do that? Well, you're gonna figure that one out for yourself through your search engine. This is not a Fedora, by the way. They say that Linux is open source software. It's true, but it's also not true. In Linux you can run a lot of closed source software. You can even run Spotify there, Steam, this type of stuff. There are distributions that favor open source software, and they have different repositories, so different servers for closed source software. With Linux you have distribution forks. That means that some other distribution has been used a base for this distribution. And for example with Ubuntu, it was this private held company Canonical and its distribution of Linux, how it's done. Derivations of that Ubuntu operating system, which is actually based on Debian originally. Canonical has its own servers. Debian has its own servers. Or .deb. So if you download a third-party program from some website into Linux, you're going to be posed, for example with Google Chrome, you're going to be posed a choice. Do you want the RPM? That's for Red Hat and that's for Fedora. Or do you want the deb? That's for Linux Mint, that's for Debian, that's for Ubuntu. Android is also Linux, that's Linux kernel. And in Android they do sandboxing of user space apps. So every app is taken as a program that you cannot really trust with the system resources and the system files. The difference over here with Windows is that on Windows, when you download a program, you probably are going to download that program from the developer's website. You're gonna get an XCE, or you're going to go on Ninit, where you get a whole package of all those apps on Windows. The problem with this Windows approach to software or the user space apps is that of course all of those apps are going to have their own updaters too. And this is the reason when you boot up a Windows system, you get all that jumble and that crap. Every app is posting you an update or something like that. It's also a security flaw in Windows. So Linux is more like iOS in that sense that you get the software only from the Apple servers. The software to get to those Apple servers, it has to go through a process, an audit. Not just any software can get on there. Let's get a little deeper then. In Linux you have those repositories, and your Linux repositories are located in a file called sources list. When you install, for example, the Google Chrome browser on your Ubuntu machine, the installer is going to create a line in that sources list for the Google Chrome repository, where it's going to get the update for the current web browser. So when we think about Linux security, not Windows security, less repositories is always better. Okay, then software availability on Linux. It's of course little different than on Windows. You have apps and programs that you cannot get on Windows and Mac, and you have those that you can get on Windows and Mac. You probably cannot get Microsoft Word on Linux. You probably cannot get Adobe Premiere on Linux. Some closed source video editing software, for example the DaVinci Resolve, you can get that on Linux. They have a Linux package for it. Yesterday, for example, I was researching into word processor stuff, and I discovered that there's this app called Scrivener. And they say that this is the app that real writers, like real authors, use. Whoever knows about that, might be just a sales pitch. You cannot get Scrivener, for example, on Linux. Not available there. So what you are gonna actually do on the computer might change quite drastically when you change to the Linux. My changing to and migrating to Linux strategy is this. If you have a knack for computers, and if you have a very powerful Windows desktop machine right now and you want to get into this Linux stuff, try Linux in VirtualBox or other virtualizer software like VMware. Try any distribution you like there. Just go through them and see what's different and just try to learn a bit about it. If you have a desktop computer and a laptop computer, after you have done this, migrate your laptop computer into Linux. Take the best distribution that you liked. This is what I did. By the way, before that, understand please that in terms of Windows security, you should be running Linux in a virtual machine too. If you want to make your Windows computer more secure, run the stuff that you don't fully trust on the VirtualBox. I'm gonna make a whole video about virtualization next too. Then let's get back to that laptop. So migrate your laptop with the best Linux distro that you liked on that VirtualBox. There's this website called Distro Watch where you can find all the distributions. I'm going to list you some of them soon and what I think about them too. Another option that you have with the laptop is to get an old laptop like a ThinkPad from Lenovo and installing Linux on that. Don't be alarmed if a certain distribution doesn't fully work on your laptop, even though you deem that as the best distro on the VirtualBox. Now you have two Linux machines. You have your laptop and you have your VirtualBox. The next endeavor you should try is to boot that Linux on your desktop machine, a live session, and try if everything works and how it works. Is it smooth operating or are there hardware compatibility issues? I sure as heck had with my AMD graphics card back in them days. What you should do next, if you are still liking that Linux and you want to get deeper into this, is that you should get another SSD. You should get another hard drive. You plug the Windows drive out of your computer and you plug in the soon to come Linux drive into that computer. And you install Linux on that without doing any modifications on that Windows disk. Don't do dual booting at this point. Don't do it. And now live with just Linux for a while. That's my strategy for it. Let's next go into those distributions. Okay, so Linux distributions, well, you can figure most of this stuff out, but the main Linux distributions that are the main branches of Linux are Debian, and from that is derived Ubuntu. As I said, Ubuntu private held company, more like a mainstream operating system in that sense. Ubuntu, great driver support. Great support for those proprietary apps you might need, and a great forum. You have a problem, you'll find it there, the solution for it. Ubuntu also great for the stability of the machine, because you have LTS version. What's the difference between an LTS and a rolling release and a point release? And what distributions are rolling, what distributions are point release, and what distributions are LTS. Debian is a LTS release kind of, but it's at the same time a point release. It's also a rolling release. With a rolling release, you don't have a distro version like Linux Mint 22.1. You don't have that version number. Instead, you get package updates with a cycle that is determined by the Linux distro operator or the repositories. How often do they update? How often do you get new software? The problem with this approach can be related to the system stability. So each package is not tested against each other package there. Arch Linux is a rolling release distribution, and Arch Linux is also the most cutting edge Linux distro out there. When a program's source code is updated, you get that on Linux, Arch Linux, probably the first. From Arch Linux there have been these branches like Manjaro and now the Endeavour OS, back in them days Antergos. These were ways to install Arch Linux with a graphical GUI. So Arch Linux cannot be installed, at least back in them days, with a GUI. You had to do it by following an instruction to do it. With Arch Linux you have some great stuff about it, like the pack AUR or the pack AUR, where you can get third-party software. And I think that how it's done is that the software is compiled on the machine from source code. So you download the source code for the program from pack AUR. Then it compiles it into a runnable or executable form on your computer. Fedora, that's a point release distro. You get a new whole upgrade each 6 months with Fedora. They don't have an LTS version. Fedora is great. Fedora is very up to date always. It's probably very close to Arch nowadays. You get the newest desktop environment version, you get the newest GNOME, you get newest version of each software. What about Debian then? Well, Debian has 3 branches that you can opt for. When you install Debian as just the default setting, it opts for the Debian stable, and Debian stable updates very seldom. It's like once in 3 weeks or something like that, and then you get the point releases. On Debian though, it's still like Ubuntu when you get the huge upgrade. For example, when it's going to update from 12 to 13. you will have to do a distro upgrade on that. Debian, they have three branches. They have the testing, and they have the unstable, and they have the stable. So Debian is the best when you just go with stable. So if you want stability and you want just it to work and you have prior knowledge of Linux, then go with Debian. But don't go with Debian as your first distro. Then there's Gentoo, and Gentoo is a source code distribution, so each package is compiled on the machine. As I explained to you before, on Fedora you have the RPMs, on Debian and Ubuntu you have the deb packages. On Gentoo you don't have that, you have source code on Gentoo repositories, and you download that source code and it uses the computer CPU power to compile that into binary form or you execute that. I've never used Gentoo, it's probably for the real nerds out there. Then there's Red Hat. Red Hat is not free. I mean, it's not free in terms of the price. And I don't know if in Red Hat there's some closed source software. But if you want a fully open source Linux system, I don't know if there's any distribution that doesn't include closed source software or closed source code at all. Then you got these smaller distributions that have been derived from another distro, like Linux Mint from Ubuntu, like Manjaro from Arch Linux, like Elementary OS from Ubuntu. There used to be this distro called CentOS. I think that was from Red Hat and Fedora. You can be rest assured that these are going to be around. Debian, for example, 30 years in the making. It's not going to be going anywhere. It survived in even the founding members, Ian Murdoch's fucking suicide. I mean, the founding member of that distro is dead. And it's still around. Debian is still around. And it's better than it used to be when he was alive. Maybe it was that kind of suicide. I have to kill myself so this distro will be better. Another great idea you might get at this point is to start use open source software on your Windows computer if you are a Windows or Mac user, by the way, right now. Do you do a lot of torrents? Well, you can do that even better on Linux. But on Linux you have a lot of torrent programs. The next thing you have to understand about Linux is that there's more to it than just the distros, because each distro also can have spins in it or different environments to use the desktop in different GUIs. So on Windows and Mac you just have the basic GUI, how it's used. You cannot change that. Or you actually could on Windows. There was something called Blean. Back in them days in Windows 7, 11 or 10, what is it right now? But you can get a lot of different GUIs for Linux, and you can change those even on the machine. You can install more than one GUI. This also applies to that Android. You can change the graphical user interface of that. But on Linux you have a lot of options, and these are called... But on Linux you have a lot of options. You have tiling window managers that you don't use the mouse with, like i3. That's like hardcore stuff. Then you have more Mac-like desktop environments and GUIs like GNOME. Then you have Windows-like GUIs like Cinnamon and KDE, LXQT, XFCE. Some GUIs are very modifiable, and you can change a lot of in there. Then you have desktop environments and GUIs like OpenBox. So figure that shit out in the VirtualBox phase, which desktop environment you like the best. Because if you happen to change that, for example, KDE and GNOME cannot really exist on the same system at the same time, even though in theory they can. They fuck each other's settings so bad that you shouldn't install them at the same time. So figure out which desktop GUI you use and you like the most. And what I would do is that I would use that across the board. And that's great about Ubuntu. It's that you just have the Ubuntu user experience, which is based on GNOME nowadays. It didn't used to be based on GNOME. They had their own desktop environment called Unity back in them days. But now they have GNOME with few modifications to it done by Canonical. So if you use that on your desktop, you should be using that on your laptop too. One of the mistakes that you can do with Linux is that you have a shitty old laptop and you just don't like to use Linux on that, and you base your opinion about Linux based on your shitty machine. Linux is all the more great when you have great hardware. You should be running Linux on the best hardware possible, of course. As a last note, be sure that you want to migrate fully into this before you do it. Don't just go head first and then be like, how can I install back this Windows stuff? Don't do that. This is the way I did it. I'm getting a book, by the way, called How Linux Works 3rd edition. I'm going to talk Linux deeper there, because what I have not done in these past years is to learn deeper about Linux. I haven't done that. So I'm gonna do it now. I have been just using Linux. It has been so great.